The Valorian scout ship dropped through the cloud cover like a stone through silk, silent and precise, landing in a clearing so perfectly calculated that not a single fern was disturbed. Kale, 7, senior scout of the Galactic Exploration Division, stepped out first. He pulled up his atmospheric reader, confirmed oxygen levels were breathable, confirmed megafauna threat levels were moderate, and confirmed that the dominant species of this planet, designation Earth, Sector 7G, Class M Biosphere, were, according to all intelligence reports, entirely unaware of the ship's presence. Good. Behind him came Tissa, his junior partner, her 4 eyes scanning the tree line with professional detachment. Then came Drovak, the cartographer, already pulling up his holographic mapping grid. And, finally, Yeln, the biologist, who immediately crouched down to collect a soil sample and began muttering about fungal networks. The jungle pressed in around them. Dense, wet, loud with things unseen. Kale, 7, pulled up the mission brief on his wrist display. Standard survey. Cataloged the local flora and fauna. Assessed the dominant species, Homo sapiens, for galactic readiness. Determine whether Earth warranted an approach from the Galactic Council or whether it needed another few centuries of quiet isolation before contact could even be considered. The preliminary reports had already painted a picture. He had read them on the 3-week journey over. Homo sapiens, bipedal, no natural armor, no natural weapons beyond rudimentary teeth and nails, average lifespan of 70 to 80 planetary rotations, 0 psionic ability, no bioluminescent signaling, no sonar, no infrared vision. Their senses were so limited it bordered on the tragic. Their physical form was soft, unspecialized. They had no claws worth speaking of, no venom, no speed that could trouble even the slowest of Valorian youth. What they did have, the report noted with something resembling academic pity, was tools. Kale, 7, had read that part and moved on. Tools were what every species used before they developed something better. He led his team deeper into the jungle. The plan was simple: observe a human settlement from a distance, record behavioral data, and leave without contact. The whole operation was supposed to take 48 hours. In and out. Easy survey, easy report, easy recommendation for continued isolation. Tissa pulled up alongside him, her translator implant running passively, picking up ambient signals. I'm getting radio frequencies, she said. Primitive, analog, and digital mixed. They're not even close to unified communication infrastructure. Expected, Kale, 7 said. Their military presence in this region is minimal. A few border patrols on the eastern edge of this forest zone. We should avoid those. We will. Drovak was already muttering about the inaccuracy of his maps. The jungle, it turned out, did not behave the way his cartographic algorithms expected. The tree coverage was denser than satellite imaging had suggested. The root systems were chaotic, interlocked in ways that made his mapping grid throw errors every few minutes. He recalibrated. Got new errors. This forest is extraordinarily complex, he said, almost offended by it. Yeln looked up from his latest soil sample, delighted. It's alive in 17 dimensions of symbiotic interaction. The fungal root networks alone are communicating chemical signals across approximately 40 kilometers of terrain. It's remarkable. It's a jungle, Kale, 7 said. Stay focused. They made camp that first night without incident. Their cloaking technology kept them invisible to local wildlife. Their atmospheric filters kept insects away. They ate their ration packs and reviewed the day's footage. An ordinary camp. Ordinary data. Nothing that challenged the preliminary reports. The second day, they found the village. It was small by any galactic standard. Wooden structures, mostly. A few with metal roofing. Children playing in a central open space. Adults moving between buildings, carrying things, talking, laughing. A cooking fire somewhere at the center with a smell that Yeln's sensor described as complex organic compounds produced through combustion of biological material, and which Tissa simply described as actually not unpleasant. They watched from the tree line, recording everything. Kale, 7 noted their physical vulnerability immediately. No protective covering beyond thin layers of woven plant and animal fiber. No augmentation visible. The children, especially, moved with a kind of reckless confidence that struck him as either bravery or ignorance, and he suspected the latter. They ran barefoot across ground that Yeln's scanner confirmed contained at minimum 4 species of venomous insect and 2 types of thorn ground cover. They don't know what they're walking on, Tissa said. They know, Yeln said, surprising them. He was studying his scanner. Their skin has developed callus adaptation in the plantar regions. Mechanical resistance to local ground hazards. It's crude, but effective. Still, Kale, Seven said. Look at them. And he laughed. A short, professional sound. Not unkind, exactly. Just the laugh of someone reading a report that confirmed what they already suspected. Tissa joined him. No armor. No weapons visible on their persons. They're just walking around. Like they own the place, Drovok said. They think they do. Kale, Seven said. That became the running joke of the observation mission. Every time a human did something that would have been suicidal for any species they'd previously cataloged, walked barefoot near a known snake habitat, swam in a river with large predatory fish, let children climb trees with no safety harness, someone would say it. Like they own the place. The humor settled into them. Not mean-spirited, the way Kale, Seven told himself. Just factual. The Valorian Empire had cataloged 942 sapient species across 4 galactic arms. Of those, exactly 0 had survived and built civilization without at minimum 2 of the following: natural armor, natural weapons, pack hunting with coordinated telepathy, bioluminescent threat display, or venomous defense. Every species that had made it to the stars had done so from a position of physical advantage. Humans had none of those things. They were soft animals that had gotten lucky with their thumbs. On the 3rd day, they went deeper into the jungle to collect additional botanical samples, and Kale, Seven, made the decision that would undo him. He split the team. Yeln and Drovok would stay near the jungle's edge, continuing environmental mapping. Kale, Seven, and Tissa would move 2 kilometers north to investigate a secondary data signature, some kind of structure, their sensors suggested, that didn't match the village profile. Could be an outpost. Could be agricultural infrastructure. Worth a look. The jungle, at that point, had been entirely accommodating. Their cloaking worked. Their sensors worked. There had been no complications. Kale, Seven, did not recalibrate his threat assessment before splitting the team. He would think about that later. The 2 of them moved north through growth so thick it swallowed the light in patches and then released it again in sudden bright gaps. Tissa kept her scanner running. Kale, Seven, kept his eyes on the canopy, where most of the local megafauna seemed to prefer. They found the structure. It was a platform, built into the trees. High up, maybe 12 meters off the ground, constructed from cut timber and lashed with rope, with a kind of rough roof overhead, and no walls at all. Open on every side. Below it, the ground was clear of undergrowth in a rough circle, as though something had been maintaining the clearing deliberately. No thermal signatures inside. Abandoned, then. Or seasonal. What is it? Tissa asked. Kale, Seven, ran the image through his anthropological database. The database returned 3 possibilities: observation post, hunting blind, ritual structure. He flagged it as inconclusive and started recording. Tissa moved around the base of the tree, scanning the ground. Boot impressions in the soil, she said. Recent. Within the last rotation cycle. So someone uses it regularly. Yes. But they're not here now. Kale, Seven, looked up at the platform. 12 meters. The ladder was a series of wooden pegs hammered into the tree trunk, spaced unevenly, worn smooth at the top of each peg from repeated use. Someone had climbed this a lot. He looked at the cleared ground. Then, back up at the platform. Then, at the angles, where the platform faced, what it looked out over, what it would see from up there. It faced a game trail. Wide, well-worn, cutting through the jungle in a long diagonal. Hoof prints in the mud at the trail's edge. Deer, probably, or whatever the local equivalent was. The cleared ground below the platform. The angles. Kale, Seven, stood very still for a moment. This was not a ritual structure. This was a hunting blind. Someone came here, climbed 12 meters into a tree, and sat very quietly above a game trail, and waited. With patience that most species would spend on something worth spending patience on. Not sitting in a tree, in the dark, in a jungle, alone, to kill something with their primitive ranged weapons. Tissa was still scanning the boot impressions. Large individual, she said. Single person, based on track pattern. They came in from the northeast, spent time at the base of the tree, maybe checking equipment, then climbed. And came back down. And came back down. Carrying something heavier on the return trip. The impressions are deeper. They looked at each other. They were successful, Tissa said. It was not a funny observation. But, Kale, Seven, made himself treated as one, because the alternative, taking it seriously, felt like something he wasn't ready to do yet. A soft animal with a stick, he said, hunting from a tree. He recorded the blind, and they moved on. They were 100 meters back toward camp when Tiss's scanner pinged. She stopped, frowned at the readout, adjusted the sensitivity. The ping came again. What? Kale, 7 asked. Movement, she said. On the ground. 40 meters. Northeast. Kale, 7 checked his own scanner. Nothing on mine. It's intermittent. Stop and start. Almost like she recalibrated again. It's not random movement. It's deliberate. She looked up. It's tracking something. What's it tracking? A pause. She turned the scanner slowly, reading the directional data. Us, she said. The cloaking field was on. That was the first thing Kale, 7 confirmed, because it was the first thing that needed confirming. He checked his wrist panel. Green across every indicator. The field was generating correctly, bending light around both of them with approximately 97% efficiency, more than sufficient to defeat any organic visual system they had ever cataloged. Human eyes, with their narrow spectral range and their embarrassing resolution at distance, should have been the easiest visual system in the sector to fool. The cloaking field was on, and something was tracking them anyway. Recalibrate, he said. His voice came out professionally flat. He was proud of that. Tissa was already doing it. Movement signature is consistent, she said. It's not an animal. The movement pattern has structure. It's pausing in intervals, changing direction in response to our position. She stopped. It changed direction when we stopped moving. So it had heard them stop, or smelled them stop, or felt the barometric shift of 2 bodies suddenly, holding still in a jungle that had been in constant motion around them. Kale, 7 ran through the possibilities. A patrol from the village. A hunter returning to the blind. A local individual who had happened to move in a direction that coincidentally mirrored their own. He chose the last possibility. Not because the data supported it. Because it was the most comfortable. We move, he said. Steady pace, northeast. Back toward Yelm and Drovak. They moved. The signal moved with them. It stayed at 40 meters. Not gaining. Not losing. Just maintaining. Which meant it was not following them accidentally, and it was not losing them, and it was not chasing them, either. It was doing something else. Something with a shape to it that Kale 7's tactical training identified with an unpleasant word he did not say out loud. Hurting. It's keeping us on this path, Tissa said quietly. I know. The path trends southeast. I know. Southeast was not northeast. Southeast was not toward Yelm and Drovak. Southeast was toward a part of the jungle they had not surveyed, with no landmarks they had mapped, away from their camp and their ship. Kale, 7 stopped walking. The signal stopped. He turned 45 degrees north and started walking again. The signal moved to intercept. He turned back. The signal eased off, resuming its 40-meter trailing position. It's blocking the northern route, Tissa said. Yes. How is it doing that without us seeing it? Kale, 7 didn't answer because the answer was one he was still working on accepting. Their cloaking field had a slight thermal bleed at the perimeter, a design compromise that had never mattered before because no species they'd surveyed could detect thermal signatures at that resolution without instruments. It was a known limitation, filed away in the field manual under acceptable tolerances, never worth worrying about. A species with no natural armor, no natural weapons, no psionic ability, and eyes barely functional in low light. A species that had, nonetheless, been sitting in trees in the dark, waiting quietly above game trails, for long enough that the wooden pegs on the ladder were worn smooth. The thermal bleed was 4.3 degrees above ambient. Barely a whisper of difference. A hunter who had spent uncounted hours in silent darkness, waiting, would know what 4 degrees of wrongness felt like in a jungle that was never exactly wrong. Kale 7's threat assessment recalibrated without him asking it to. We contact Yelm, he said. Now. He hit the comm static. He tried again. More static. Not the interference of terrain. He'd worked through mountains and deep cave systems without comm failure this significant. This was directional. Localized. Something between them, and the camp was absorbing or redirecting the signal. Electronic dampening? Tissa asked. On what power source? Their primitive, passive dampening, she said. Dense conductive material arranged to redirect signal. She looked at the trees around them. Then up. Kale, 7 looked up. Thin wire. Almost invisible, strung between trees at varying heights. Not in a pattern he could see immediately. Just present. Above them. in the trees they had walked between. He looked back along their path. The wire was behind them too. Someone had strung this before they arrived, before they'd come this way, which meant whoever was tracking them had predicted their path, or had laid a wide enough net that prediction was unnecessary. He stopped treating this as a manageable field complication. "We need to break the perimeter," he said. "Move fast, move west, cross the wire line before it." The sound came from above him. Not loud. A soft, controlled sound. Boots on bark. Something settling its weight on a branch with the deliberate care of someone who had done this 1,000 times and understood every creak of every tree they'd ever climbed. He looked up. The shape was in the canopy. 12 meters up, exactly where the blind had been. Except this wasn't a blind, and he wasn't at the blind, and the geometry of that was wrong in a way that took him 3 full seconds to process. The shape was human. Male, large, wearing clothing that broke his silhouette into pieces of shadow and leaf and bark, so that even looking directly at the branch he'd been sitting on, Kale-7's visual system kept trying to categorize him as part of the tree. Not because of technology, because of paint and sewn fabric and the deliberate layering of texture that his species had apparently developed for the specific purpose of becoming invisible inside a place they understood completely, and their prey did not. The hunter looked down at them. They looked up at him. He was not using any instrument. His eyes moved between them with the calm, measuring quality of someone who had located his targets long ago and was now simply confirming what he already knew. In his hands was a long object. A rifle, Kale-7's database confirmed. Bolt action. Old design, the database noted. Manual operation. Not automatic. A human with a manually operated projectile weapon and no apparent augmentation, perched in a tree, had tracked 2 members of a species 50 years ahead of his own in technological development through a cloaking field they had never encountered before, through a jungle that was supposed to make the task of silent tracking impossible, and had herded them to a position of his choosing using wire he'd strung before they arrived. None of those things were supposed to be possible. The hunter didn't fire. He hadn't fired the whole time. He sat in the tree and he looked at them and he said something in his language that Tiss's translator, running passively, caught and converted in pieces. She made a strangled sound. "What?" Kale-7 demanded. He said she stopped. "Reran it. He said he'd been watching us since we landed." The clearing. Not a single fern disturbed. But the landing had left 4.3 degrees of thermal bloom across a 60-meter radius for approximately 11 minutes as the engines cooled. A hunter who spent his nights in trees knew what the jungle's temperature was supposed to be. The hunter climbed down from the tree. Not fast, not slow, with the unhurried efficiency of someone who was in no danger and felt no need to perform otherwise. He dropped the last 2 meters, landed in the cleared space below the branch without looking at the ground, and stood. He was tall by human standards, built in the way that hard outdoor labor built people, not the exaggerated musculature of a species that had been designed for combat, but the functional, dense kind that came from doing the same difficult physical task for years. He looked at them with the same expression he'd had in the tree. Patient, calm, attentive, not surprised. Kale-7 realized with a cold clarity that the hunter had never been surprised. He spoke again. The translator finished its work. "You've been watching my village," the hunter said. "I've been watching you watch it." A pause, in which he did nothing dramatic. Just waited. Then, "You want to talk, or you want to keep pretending you're invisible?" Tissa let the cloaking field drop. It felt like the only honest thing left to do. The hunter looked at them, really looked at them, in the direct light, no more obstruction, and his expression didn't change. Not the wide eyes of shock, not the retreat of fear, just the same evaluating focus, extended to take in their full appearance, and then a single small nod, the way someone nods when a thing they already suspected is confirmed. "Figured you weren't local," he said. "You're not afraid of us," Kale-7 said. His translator handled the output. The hunter considered the question with apparent sincerity, as if fear were a reasonable conversational topic, and he was simply being accurate. "I've sat in the dark alone in this jungle for 15 years, he said. "Afraid doesn't really stick anymore." Kale-7 looked at the wire in the trees. The blind, the worn pegs, the ghost in the canopy camouflage, the cold, systematic patience of a creature that had spent 15 years practicing stillness and silence in a place that was actively trying to kill it, until both became less like skills and more like the way it simply was. No armor, No natural weapons. No psionic ability. No speed. No venom. Just time and attention and a willingness to be uncomfortable in the dark for as long as the situation required. He thought about the 942 species in the catalog. He thought about the laugh, like they own the place. He looked at the hunter and understood, with a sinking certainty that felt like the ground shifting, that the report had not been wrong about the facts. It had been catastrophically wrong about what the facts meant. His name was Marcos. He told them that when Tissa asked, and he gave the name the same way he gave everything, plainly, without performance, like a man who had learned long ago that the truth was less work than anything else. He did not ask what they were. He did not ask where they came from. He looked at the ship when they walked him to it that evening, the silver geometry of it sitting in its perfect, undisturbed clearing, and he looked for a long time with the expression of a man doing math in his head. Then, he said, far. One word. A conclusion, not a question. Very far. Kale, 7 confirmed. Marcos nodded. He walked around the ship once, not touching it, just looking, studying its lines with the same measuring focus he'd used in the canopy. Then, he came back, and he sat down on a root at the clearing's edge, and he waited. Kale, 7 understood, by that point, what waiting looked like when a human did it genuinely. It was not the restless waiting of a creature doing nothing while time passed. It was the other kind, deliberate, inhabited, the kind that stored energy rather than wasting it. He sat down too. They talked through the translators for 4 hours. Marcos answered questions in the direct, economical way of someone who respected the value of information and wasted no words around it. Yes, he'd known about the thermal bloom from the landing. Yes, he'd identified 2 of them before they'd gone a kilometer into the jungle. The jungle amplified sound in specific ways he'd learned to read, and they moved like animals that had never had to worry about being heard. Yes, the wire was a standard technique for disrupting signal in the valley. He developed it originally for coordinating hunts by disrupting the radio traffic from the military border station, which bled into civilian frequencies and muddied his game location system. He had a game location system, a network of passive sensors, mechanical, no electronics, integrated into the root network and the water table. Pressure variations translated to vibration, translated to a coded system he developed himself over 6 years of refinement. Yeln, who had joined them after Marcos guided Kale, 7 through a radio gesture, a specific pattern of signal disruptions that turned out to be a code he'd established, and Kale, 7 had not known he was broadcasting it until Marcos explained it, sat forward, and listened to this with an expression that Kale, 7 had never seen on his biologist's face before. Reverence. The root network, Yeln said, through the translator. You're using the mycorrhizal signal pathways. The mushroom lines, Marcos said, and nodded. They carry pressure waves differently than the soil. I figured that out after about 3 years of the system not working right. Once I understood the delay patterns, I could calibrate. 3 years. To learn the signal characteristics of a fungal network. Not with instruments. By paying attention. Yeln looked at Kale, 7. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The preliminary report had noted the mycorrhizal networks as a marvel of biological engineering, 40 kilometers of chemical communication, remarkable, and had said nothing about humans interacting with it because the preliminary report had assumed they weren't. Kale, 7 asked the question he'd been building toward for 2 hours. Why haven't you said anything? To anyone. About us. Marcos looked at him steadily. Who would I tell? Your government. Your military. A pause. Not a hesitation, a consideration. And then, what happens? Kale, 7 didn't answer. Your ship gets taken apart, Marcos said. Your information gets classified. You either get studied or you get locked up or both. If you're lucky, a few politicians find out and spend the next 20 years arguing about it. He looked at the ship again. You came here to figure out if we're ready for whatever comes next. Can't do that from a government lab. The logic was sound. That was what was uncomfortable about it. Not that it was the logic of a simple man making a simple observation. It was the logic of someone who had mapped the likely outcomes, calculated the most efficient path to his desired result, and made his decision before Kale, 7 had even thought to ask the question. What do you want? Kale, 7 asked. Marcos was quiet for a moment. He looked at the jungle, at the trees going dark at their upper canopy as the sun moved. Something moved in the undergrowth 100 meters away, and his eyes went to it automatically, identified it, dismissed it. all in the time it took Kale, 7, to turn his head. Same thing you came for, Marcos said. Information. So they traded. Not officially. Not with any protocol Kale 7's training had prepared him for. He would file this later as an irregular first contact event and accept whatever administrative consequence came with it. Because the alternative, shutting down the conversation with a man who had outpaced every assumption in the preliminary report, felt like the worst professional failure. Marcos asked about the other species. Not their weapons, not their technology, not their political structures. He asked about their environments, their sensory ranges, the things they were good at, and the things they weren't. He was building a picture. Kale, 7, recognized the behavior. He had done it himself, in this jungle, for 3 days. Catalog. Assess. Determine readiness. Marcos was doing it to them. When Kale, 7, pointed this out, Marcos almost smiled. Not quite. You came to figure out if we're worth talking to, he said. Seems fair. And what have you concluded? The almost smile again. That you underestimated us. Yes, Kale, 7 said. No point denying it. It happens a lot, Marcos said. He didn't say it with bitterness. He said it with the calm of a man who had factored it into his calculations and moved on. We don't look like much. No offense to whatever you were expecting, but I know what we look like. Small, soft, noisy. He glanced toward the direction of the village. No armor, no venom. Takes us 15 years just to get decent at sitting still in the dark. And yet, Kale, 7 said. And yet, Marcos agreed. Drovak, who had been quietly collecting data this entire time, looked up from his instruments. The report, he said carefully, in Valorian, not yet translated, looking at Kale, 7, needs to be rewritten. Kale, 7 thought about the 942 species. The criteria: natural armor, natural weapons, coordinated psionic hunting, bioluminescent threat display, venom. Humans had none of that. What they had instead was something the catalog had no field for. Something that looked, from the outside, like limitation, like vulnerability, like the permanent underdog condition of a soft animal too stubborn to understand it was losing. But, from the inside, from the perspective of the inside, it was something else. 15 years in the dark learning to be still. 3 years calibrating a signal network in a fungal root system using nothing but attention and patience and the willingness to be wrong and correct and try again. A wire in the trees, strung before the enemy arrived, because the territory had been learned so completely that the enemy's path could be predicted before the enemy made it. The Galactic Council's criteria assumed that a species needed to be built for survival in order to survive. It had never considered, apparently, that a species might simply decide to be good at it. Kale, 7, pulled up the mission report template on his wrist display, looked at the readiness criteria boxes. He closed the template. He pulled up a blank document instead. He would need to write this one from scratch, because none of the existing language fit. Marco stayed with them through the night. He slept for 4 hours with the accuracy of someone who had learned to ration rest the way other people ration water, woke before the jungle changed its morning sound profile, and was sitting at the clearing's edge when Kale, 7, came out in the gray pre-light, watching the tree line with an expression that was not watchfulness in the defensive sense. Just attention, pure and ongoing. The face of an animal that was always slightly more present than its circumstances required. You'll come back, Marcos said. Not a question. There will be others, Kale, 7 said. When the report is filed, others will come. To study us. To assess. Marcos looked at the jungle for a moment. Tell them what you told me about the Velhari, he said, referencing one of the species Kale, 7 had described. Large, armored, aggressive at first contact. Deeply formal once trust was established. What about them? Tell them we're like that, Marcos said. But without the armor. He paused. And louder. Kale, 7 looked at him. He was still not entirely sure if the man was joking. That, he thought, was probably the point. He filed the report 6 weeks later, from the ship, with the jungle 11 light minutes behind them. He filed it under a category that didn't exist yet, which required him to create one. He labeled it, Species Demonstrating Non-Standard Resilience Pathway. Do not apply existing contact protocols. The appendix ran 40 pages. On the first page of the appendix, he wrote one line by way of summary, knowing the council would read it first, and the line would either make sense to them or it wouldn't, and the ones for whom it didn't make sense were the ones who needed to be kept away from Earth until they did. The line read, They have no advantages. They kept going anyway. Adjust your assumptions accordingly. 3 light years away, in a jungle that had grown quiet now the ship was gone, Marcos climbed back to his blind in the early dark, settled his weight on the platform with the ease of a man settling into a chair he'd owned for years, and looked out over the game trail. The wire was still up. He'd leave it there. Not for the scouts, if they came back. Though they'd come back, he was certain enough of that. For the same reason it had always been there. Because the jungle was the jungle. Because something was always moving through it. Because knowing your ground, knowing it completely, knowing every degree of its temperature, and every variation in its sound, and every way its darkness was different from ordinary darkness, was the thing that made the difference between being the hunter and being the hunted. He'd learned that 15 years ago, cold and alone and more afraid than he'd admitted to anyone since. He'd stayed anyway. 40 meters below, the game trail lay empty and silent and full of everything that was about to move through it. He waited.